folks, and welcome back to NTI's Japan Real Estate Podcast. I'm your host, Ziv Nakajima again, and this podcast was brought to you, among others, by Emil Gorgis, a Tokyo real estate agent who specializes in serving international or mixed nationality families looking for the perfect family home. So Emil's an Australian. He's been living here in Japan for the past 2 decades, 8 years of which he's been actively buying, selling, and managing real estate properties in the city on behalf of his own family and a great many happy clients. And he also acts as a mortgage broker on behalf of his clients. So his company has a dedicated loan officer in many of the Japanese mega banks. And if you're a regular listener, you probably already know him from our JREP, the Japan Real Estate Experts panel sessions. So you're probably already aware that the man is an absolute fountain of wisdom on all things related to real estate in Japan, and in particular to family homes, the greater Tokyo metropolitan area, and mortgages. And most importantly, he's incredibly generous with his time and advice, which he's more than happy to provide at no cost or commitment to anyone asking. So if you've been thinking about buying your home in Tokyo, but you've been sitting on the fence for a while, or if you just want to have a chat in English with a real expert, drop him a line on emil.gorgis, that's emil.gorges, emil.gorgis at tokyorealty.jp. Hit him up today and start exploring your options. All right, so for today's episode, I've recently had the pleasure of being interviewed for the Krewe of Japan podcast. That's Krewe, not crew with a C. As in an organization or association that stages a parade or other event for a carnival celebration, associated especially with Mardi Gras in New Orleans. And the Krewe of Japan are indeed the Japanese Society of New Orleans. So they've got a fantastic podcast dedicated to various aspects of Japanese culture and to Japan-related topics overall. Highly recommended. And they brought me on to talk real estate in Japan, obviously, which, as you've probably figured out by now, if you regularly listen to this podcast, I'm happy to talk about till the cows come home. So we talk all things related to real estate in Japan, its accessibility to foreigners, whether resident or non-resident, the types of deals available on the market here, the types of clients that we serve and the services that we provide to them. We talk akiyas, abandoned homes, short-term rentals, Airbnb, and much, much more. So really fun conversation. Hope you find some value in it. Enjoy, and I'll see you again on the other side.
All right. Welcome back to the podcast. Today we have a very special guest. All of our guests are very special, but today's guest is very special. We have Ziv Nakajima Magen from Nippon Trading International. He's a co-founder and
Partner?
CEO. Partner. I messed it up. Hold on. I'll re-record that piece and I'll put that in there. All right. So, so why don't you take it before we jump into our questions? Ziv, would you like to take a second to introduce yourself?
Sure. So, Ziv Nakajima again, as you mentioned, my wife and I co-founded Nippon Trading International, or NTI for short, about a decade ago now. And what we essentially do is we represent people who are dealing in real estate in Japan, but for some reason or another are either not able to or not comfortable to handle things on their own. So about 80% of them are foreigners who don't actually reside in Japan. And for various reasons, we can get into that later, but they can't open a bank account. They don't have an address and a phone number, which are still very much required when you're dealing with Japanese entities. And of course, Japanese entities usually are not too comfortable dealing directly with foreigners in any language other than Japanese, especially ones not residing in the country. So we're like a one-stop shop for people who are either buying or selling or managing real estate in Japan, whether it's investment properties, holiday homes, what have you. And 20% of our customers live in Japan, but again, for some reason or another, either language or they're just not comfortable or confident enough to do it on their own. So we help them as well.
So what you're saying is you're the man that everyone wants to be friends with.
If they're into real estate, yeah, I guess.
That's awesome. So before we jump further into the real estate side of things and your background in Japan, we ask our guests, it's a kind of a common question. So if you've listened to our podcast before, you've heard it before,
Yep.
We like to ask our guests what their connection is with New Orleans, whether or not they've been here before, or if you heard of New Orleans, what's the first thing you think of? And if you've been here, what's your fondest or funniest memory?
So I haven't been to New Orleans except via remote participation through movies and stuff. But I'm sorry if it's cliche, but I'd have to say jazz. I'm a big jazz fan. Not like a big expert on it, but I just love it. So I'm sure that's most of what I'll be doing in New Orleans is just club hopping, I guess.
There you go. There's
And
plenty of
nothing's wrong with
opportunities
that.
there. So yeah.
Yeah.
We usually get jazz and we usually get Mardi Gras. I think those are the two big ones, or like French Quarter
that
or
one as
something like
well.
that.
That's right.
Yeah, we just had Mardi Gras, and it's over now. And now we're about to do what St. Patrick's Day parades over here. It's
Yeah,
craziness.
parades never stop. We got festivals
Funny,
all
like I
year
said, my
round.
exposure to New Orleans is mostly through cinema or TV shows. So in my head, every time there's a Mardi Gras, there's got to be like spies jumping between balconies and stuff happening on the street. Right?
Mardi Gras kind of in the background, right?
Yeah.
Awesome.
That's great.
Well, to jump in, we do want to, get some really in-depth background of you. And so, what's your Japan journey? What led to your interest in Japan and eventually living there?
Well, like a lot of us here, I sort of married into the country almost 20 years ago now, I want to say. My first wife was Japanese. We actually met in Australia when I was living in Australia. I'm originally from Israel and didn't know anything about Japan whatsoever. So she was my introduction to Japan, so to speak. But then living together, I've been coming and going with her, a few months at a time every year to visit the parents, the in-laws, and so forth. And then we sort of lived here for about a year when our son was born. She wanted to be close to her parents during that time. And then we came back to Australia. And then unfortunately, when he was about a year and a half old, this is about more than 10 years ago now, she passed away. She got cancer suddenly, and it was just very, very sudden, and she passed away.
Oh,
and then I wanted to somehow keep the connection alive to Japan for his sake. I didn't, again, I'm originally from Israel, so that connection is always going to be, relevant. And Australia was great, but it was for me like a host country. It's not somewhere that I, emotionally attached to.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to somehow set a foothold in Japan, financially and residency wise, just to enable him to be connected to that part of his heritage. So I was looking for something to invest in or some sort of business to set up, and not being too experienced with anything investment-wise except real estate, I sort of automatically was drawn to real estate in Japan as well. And not speaking, speaking a little bit of domestic Japanese at the time, but not really anything close to business skills. I obviously needed a business partner, which is one thing linked to another, is how I met my current wife, Chikako. So she started off being my business partner. She wanted to get into international business. I wanted a Japanese partner, and we started working together. We purchased a few properties for our own portfolio to start with. And having done that 1, 2, 3 times, we sort of realized that there should be a lot of people out there who would be interested in the market, because it's a very attractive market, but would be running into the same sort of blockages or walls that we've been running through the first time around. So we started marketing the service to others, and the rest is history, kind of thing.
That's awesome.
Mm.
Yeah, I just, your story is very unique. A bunch of the guests that we have on, they already had like a, knowledge of Japan. They've like either been, or they studied up on Japanese culture before going over there. So I really like that you pointed out, like, you just didn't really have any kind of predetermined conception about Japan. And so it's very interesting. And now you're like so deep rooted in Japan via business. I really find that very interesting.
Yeah, I didn't have a clue. And to be honest, the Japanese that I've been meeting and hanging out with in Australia, because they're the backpacker types or the surfer types, like the people who come to Australia, right? The culture shock was very much in place when I actually came to the country for the first time, because they were a lot more like Australians than Japanese, the ones that I've met. So so I went through the same kind of things that people go through when they come here for the first time, I think.
That's good. Makes you relatable when you're doing, business with one another. That's awesome.
Yeah, and I really like the fact that you were really interested in keeping your keeping your son's heritage kind of in the forefront. Like my wife is Japanese as well, and we have 2 kids, and one was just born 4 months ago. One of the reasons why I was running a little behind this afternoon, we're just trying to like make sure we keep that in front of him. The Japanese culture and Japanese language and just everything, any opportunity. And it's been tough with the pandemic and everything, being able to not get over there because we used to travel quite a bit, like once a year or at least for the first few years of his life. So it's been tough the last few years not being able to, really get over there and experience it. And I think that's a really important part when you have children that are, from different backgrounds that are shared and experience multiple cultures and being international is great. So
yeah, these days it'll be it's a lot harder to keep the other part of his heritage alive. Like he's very much Japanese at the moment. He's been here since he was 3.5 years old or so. So he doesn't behave like a Japanese person around the house, but if you look at him outside, he's by the book Japanese.
It sounds like mine's the opposite.
Yeah, I would imagine.
Although less and less like Japanese, it's like language is a struggle. But I don't want to get on that side. That's a whole nother conversation for another day.
Another whole conversation. But to get deep into our topic for today, which is exploring real estate in Japan, something I hear is like purchasing property in Japan can seem very daunting to foreigners for many reasons and almost an impossible task, it seems. A common thought many foreigners may have is that they, can't purchase property such as a house in Japan. Can foreigners, both who live in Japan and those who do not, purchase a house in Japan? And, what are the main differences in the process for a foreigner living in Japan versus a foreigner who is not living in Japan? Because you said 80% of your customers, aren't living in Japan, whereas 20% are. So I'm really interested in finding out the differences between the two.
Sure. So, that misconception and another one, which I'll get to in a minute, are very common. And it makes sense because Japan's actually the only country in all of the Asia Pacific region that doesn't have any official limitations on foreign ownership of land or property. So you can definitely, all land in Japan is freehold basically, and foreigners are entitled to the same rights that everybody else, all residents have when they're purchasing and selling property here. So on an official sort of government policy level, there's absolutely no difference between a foreigner, whether resident or non-resident, purchasing property in Japan. In fact, non-residents are exempt from a few municipal taxes that residents have to pay. So taxation-wise, ownership-wise, everything is exactly the same. The country is completely open. Cultural heritage properties or, land that's right near an army base or protected agricultural land is maybe a different matter, but that's a tiny fraction of the market. So when you're thinking house or condo unit or building, that's all completely open. The challenge is not in the official policies, but there's a big gap between what's officially acceptable from a government standpoint and what's actually feasible and doable on the ground. So everything is open legally, but it's very, very difficult unless you're purchasing in central Tokyo or central Osaka or maybe in some of the international ski resorts. There you would have English-speaking professionals who are used to working with foreigners. But everywhere else in the country, which is usually where people are more interested in, whether it's for a holiday home in the countryside or for investment property with high returns, those locations are very foreigner shy. So the sellers, the real estate professionals, the local tax authorities, government authorities, they don't have the experience and they don't have the inclination to deal with foreigners, let alone non-resident foreigners. And Japan being such a huge domestic market, they've never really had the need to wrap their head around how to transfer, receive funds from overseas, send post overseas, communicate in English. They just don't know how to do it. And to be honest, it's a bit of a hassle for them. They've got such a big domestic market to draw on. They're not really catering to overseas buyers. So that's where the challenges come in. And that's where a company like ours comes in handy.
Yeah, good. Because, as a foreigner myself. Not that I plan to move to Japan or anything, but, just as a person that loves Japan, goes there a lot, one of the things that I do is, I can't help but to look at property in Japan. I'm like, ooh, this house is really nice. And, I'm sure a lot of other people are thinking the same thing as me. When they see a house, they're like, oh my gosh, this is gorgeous. I wish I could, have this house in, I don't know, Saitama. And, I would love to live there. It looks beautiful. And, I'm sure the first thing that crosses their mind is, oh, but I'm a foreigner, so there's no way I can. So it's good to hear from you, and, that you have this company that can actually help foreigners, realize that dream.
Yeah, and even for holiday, like from a financial perspective, it makes. I mean, if you're coming here for 2-3 weeks a year, then yeah, just stay wherever you want to stay. But if you're coming in on a more regular basis and more often than that, or for longer periods of time, it just makes financial sense to buy a little condo or a little house that you can actually stay in without having to pay for hotels or Airbnbs or what have you.
Yeah, I mean
Awesome.
that's really awesome, because again, I never really thought about purchasing, or even that never really crossed my mind, even really a condo or anything, even though I have extended family living over there. My mother-in-law and my sister-in-law live over there, but never actually thought about it. Now after this conversation, I'm sure I'm going to be doing the same thing as Jen. I'm going to have to ask Jen for some websites that she's using to look at properties. But coming back to that though, what might be expected of someone who is a foreigner that's trying to purchase a house in Japan or a property in general? Are there any criteria that needs to be met for that person to be, that they need to be aware of prior to even going through the process as a whole?
Well, firstly, they need to be aware of that if they're non-residents and without a regular historical income stream in Japan, then financing is not going to be available to them. So there are no loans for non-resident, even Japanese who haven't been living in the country for a while. And are no longer earning their salaries or income in Japan, even they can't access any loans. So it's more of a Japanese income stream factor than a residency factor.
Okay.
And the only solutions for that are if you set up a company or a branch office of a foreign company in Japan, and you start doing business in the country, or even if you don't, you may be eligible for a loan from certain particular lenders. But then, I mean, the cost of upkeep for a company on an annual basis is going to be at least $3,000 to $4,000 a year. So unless if it's an investment property and you're making enough money to cover that and then some, then it makes sense. But if half of your income is going to go for company upkeep, that just doesn't really make sense. And you don't really need that in many cases, because properties, again, aside from central Tokyo, Osaka, and some international hotspots, property in Japan is still very, very affordable. So they had 2.5 decades of deflation. So since the 1990s, when the bubble burst here, properties have dropped down to about half of the price that they were back in the day. And the rest of the world has kind of moved on and gone beyond that. So now Tokyo and Osaka are back to what you'd expect from major cities, but the rest of the country is still very cheap. So if we're talking about that, like a holiday condo unit, just like a little hotel room type in maybe an older building, say up to 20 square meters, in a lot of cities around Japan, they go for 30, 40,000 US dollars. So for the price of a deposit that you'd put on a loan elsewhere, you could already buy the property outright.
I was about to say, if you had let's say like purchasing a house in the US, generally they want to see, if possible, you can get out of the homeowner's insurance or the purchasing insurance if you put 20% down. So I was about to say, if you can afford up front to put some kind of down payment on a house in the US, then basically, like you said, some of those homes that may be affordable in the countryside or in the more remote areas of the country, you may not even need to be worrying about like financing it or anything like that. Just purchase outright.
Yes, I would say though, with those countryside, I mean, you read a lot of articles about Japan's giving away homes for free, and you can buy a house for $500 or $5. And that's essentially true, but you're getting a dump. So if you are buying just because Japanese building materials are not very durable, they're not really meant to be. They're mostly wooden structures, or at best maybe steel frame structures. So if you're buying a condo unit in a reinforced concrete block, that's one thing. But if you're actually buying a house, and and it's older than, say, 25, 30 years, the annual maintenance is going to be quite steep. So the roof, the walls, termite protection, all of these things need to be done on a fairly regular basis, and the houses deteriorate far faster. So those cheap houses are extremely run down. So if you're buying something for like 30, 40, 50,000, you're probably going to be spending at least another 100,000 just to bring it up to speed, kind of thing. If you're buying an actual house, you probably want to set your sights on 100, maybe 150 to get something that's livable and doesn't require immediate renovations.
And not to, deviate from the conversation too far, but those Akia homes too, if I'm not mistaken, I've read in a few articles or here and there, I've heard about them, that they kind of come with some strings attached. You have to stay or live in the community when you're purchasing the home. You have to basically invest and raise your family. They want to have like a family oriented purchase. They want it to be younger folks who have kids that are going to grow up and live and give back to the community. Yes. Is that kind of common for those type of lower, I guess the ones that require a less amount of money to purchase outright? They do come with some ties to it where you have to agree or sign a contract to stay in the community for an extended period of time?
Well, the ones that you're referring to are ones that are part of particular municipal government initiatives in particular locations. So if there's a particular township that's losing population fast and the government wants to try and spruce it up, then they're going to put out these kind of deals. And in those cases, then yes, they'll give you a free or almost free house, and they'll even participate or subsidize the renovations and so forth. But in that case, yes, they want you to move there. They want you to start a family there and contribute to the local community. So there are strings attached. But regardless of that, there are very cheap houses just on the market. There's something called the Akia Bank, which is like a local municipality website that lists all of the empty and abandoned homes that might be available if you want to grab them for cheap. But again, they would be in pretty bad shape. So you can buy them cheaply. They're not going to be free like the government initiative ones, but they would be 20, 30, 40, 50,000 US, including the land parcel, which is usually going to be quite big in the countryside. But there's a lot of work. So unless it's like a labor of love project and you're planning to move there and do it yourself, or you're planning to start a guest house there and you've got a whole 5-10 year plan in mind on how you're going to rejuvenate the house, it's not something that you would do. Don't expect to buy that and immediately be able to just use it for holiday once a year kind of thing. It's not going to be applicable.
Yeah, I used to live in Iwaki City in Fukushima, and where I lived in the little the town was very close to the countryside, about a 5-minute drive out here and rice paddies and stuff. So, I mean, you would see some of those homes though, like that they look abandoned, like just ghost house, and like no one in there, windows broken, like nothing, no lights, no cars, no people, So I'm sure that's kind of what you're looking at when you were looking at those types of properties, right?
The very cheap ones, yes, correct.
Yeah.
I mean, there's not going to be any intentional. I mean, there's no squatters or anything of that sort in Japan. It's just nature taking its toll, kind of thing.
Sure.
Well, with the question that Doug posed, you briefly mentioned, about the housing market in Japan, how the bubble crashed, but Tokyo and cities like Osaka kind of recovered in some sense. But I kind of want to touch back on that. Seeing as how is the housing market in Japan as a whole, and are there differences from the housing market in America? Like, for example, when we buy property, we're thinking about property value and the investment in the long run. So like we may buy a house for like $140,000. That's being very generous, but $140,000
is not that case anymore.
but if we put improvements on the house and stuff like that, it raises the value of the house to almost like $230,000. So how's the housing market in Japan versus America when it comes to stuff like that?
So the fundamentals here are a little bit different to what you're probably used to, and not just in America, in most, maybe not most other countries, but definitely most Western countries. So renovations can bring up the value of a house. If you bought a house that's quite old and hasn't been touched up since it was built, and you renovate it to modern standards, then yes, it will get a better price when you resell it. But generally speaking, Japan isn't a capital appreciation environment. So the last decade, like since 2012, end of 2012, when Prime Minister Abe came into power, and he had his Abenomics, and at least on the surface, things were definitely moving up. So we have had some property hikes, and this is when Tokyo and Osaka actually came back to where they were pre-bubble, and they're still there. But the rest of the country hasn't been affected that much. So there are some hotspots. There's Fukuoka City, where we live, which was kind of a star and the rising star, and that's been on the rise since 2012 as well. It's like the gateway to Western Japan. And there's Niseko up in Hokkaido. It's a famous international ski resort, and they're selling properties for millions and millions of dollars and constantly building new resorts and so forth. But aside from that, the rest of the country has been pretty stagnant. So the Western mentality of real estate cycles coming over every 7 years, and if not doubling, significantly raising the price of the property, and that's a trend that goes on and on and on over time. Not something that we would bank on strategically. So if you're purchasing a property here for your own personal use, you should be aware of the fact that it's most likely not going to gain in value. And if you're purchasing an investment property, you shouldn't be banking on any capital growth as well, as far as a financial strategy is concerned. So for investment purposes, Japan is very much a cash flow market. It's got a lot of attractive things going for it, but capital growth is definitely not part of them.
Okay, yeah, that is different. Well, Doug, we'll have to tell Nigel, who is our other co-host. He, in a previous episode in season 2, we were talking all about Hokkaido, and after our interview with our guest, he was like, I'm ready to move to Hokkaido. Well, we gotta tell him maybe not so much.
Right, exactly. I mean, look, the upside of that is that properties are still very, very cheap, right? There's no capital growth. It means that you can buy them cheaply. So that's a definite plus.
Yeah.
And I mean, look, people come to Japan. Again, the holiday home buyers that we serve come to Japan because they love Japan. They like a particular location, or they like the country as a whole. We've got people who are saying, just, as long as I'm 30 minutes from any city, I don't care. I just want to be in Japan. We got people that like the snow, that like the beaches down here in Kyushu or Okinawa or what have you. And that's a lifestyle choice, right? It's not necessarily something, but the Western concept that, even if I buy a family home, it's going to be an asset that would appreciate in value, you kind of need to put that aside. And for investors, the people who buy into Japan for investment purposes, the cash flow is quite high compared to what you get in other let's call it first world countries, right? So let's say high single digits. In Tokyo, maybe 5% if you're lucky, but other cities can still go up to 7-8% annual net return before tax. And the tenants are super stable and hassle-free. I mean, Japanese being Japanese, again, there's no squatters. If somebody is late on payment, which is very rare in Japan, and if they're chronically late or missing on payments, you just send them a letter and they politely move out, right? There's no forced evictions. You don't need to apply to court to kick a tenant out and wait for 2 or 3 years like you do in some countries. It just doesn't happen here, and they tend to stay in place for a very long time compared to other countries. So your average single or young couple, usually between 4 to 5 years tenancy on average, with a lot of them in place for 10, 20 years. Families can be in place even longer than that. And the business environment is very headache-free and convenient and professional as well. So you never need to worry about a property manager, just letting the property fall into disrepair or running off with your money. Insurance companies, HOAs, nobody's got their hands in your pockets to constantly hit you with charges and fees that you wouldn't be expecting. That just doesn't happen here. And the affordability is a big thing. So if a single asset overseas, you can probably buy 3 or 4 or 5 of them here. Just gives you more diversity and hedging and so forth. So it's a very attractive environment for investment, but not in the sense that you would be used to in a capital appreciation kind of country.
Wow, that was really more in depth than I thought you were going to give. So I'm glad you did. No, I'm so glad you did, because you just brought up stuff that I just never even thought of to ask. So I'm so glad you did. But actually, you kind of touched on it. And so I kind of want to bring you back to it. And it's this big city versus countryside homes. Are there any benefits depending on where you decide to purchase a house in Japan?
Benefits as
Just like, like maybe, okay, so we already kind of know, you said, the big cities, their value in property, is kind of staying stable. And you were already saying like countryside, you're looking at those more cheaper houses, preferably. Are there any other distinct benefits between the two that maybe we can't think of right now? Like all we see is the dollar signs, but what else do you think there is between the two?
Well, if you are thinking about financial gains, definitely the countryside is a bit iffy investment-wise, just because Japan's the fastest aging population in the world and the fastest shrinking population in the world. People are, the population average age is getting older and older, and not many people are having babies. And that what that means is that all of those little villages and townships are slowly emptying out and conglomerating into the bigger metropolitan centers, right? So at some point, it's just not going to be worth it. Infrastructure quality declines, like, the bus runs 2-3 times a day, then once a day. And you want to go to a hospital, it's a fair bit of a drive. It's just less and less services being issued to those smaller communities because there's just not enough people to maintain them there. And so the younger people, when they grow up, immediately move out of those smaller townships to the big cities. And even the older people, when they actually need, support close at hand, they just can't stay there anymore, right? So if you're buying a property out in the countryside, your chances of getting a tenant when the property becomes vacant is a lot lower. So your vacancies are going to be much longer. You're going to have to charge lower and lower rents as the population declines there. And unless you're actively taking action to market the place as a guest house or a resort or starting an actual business there, and that's going to be obviously very hands-on. It's not like a passive investment. It's not really a good investment, right? So definitely get a house in the countryside if you want the quality of life and you want to live in the countryside. But for financial reasons, the asset class of choice is not wooden houses. It's going to be either units in co-owned reinforced concrete blocks, so condo units, or it's going to be a small building that's going to be wood or steel framed wood, but you own the entire structure and you can take care of renovations yourselves. And again, not too old, maybe on purchase, maybe 20 years at most. And you want to be not necessarily in a big metropolitan center, but you want to look at so part of the due diligence that you do when you purchase property in Japan, especially for investment purposes, is you look at the population figures of that particular municipality. So you want to make sure that the town has got stable population, more than a single kind of, one-trick pony kind of industry or single employer. Just in case if that, single employer or single industry for some reason peters out, then there's suddenly nothing going for the town, right? We interrupt this broadcast. I always wanted to say this. We interrupt this broadcast to tell you about Tokyo Family Stays. They're a short-term rentals company in Tokyo, and they offer a home away from home experience, which is just perfect for remote working, quarantining, or if you just need somewhere quiet to hide away from the world. So they offer a variety of options for families, for corporate relocations, or simply if you're transitioning between homes in Tokyo. Now, the properties are super comfortable, tastefully furnished, fully equipped with all amenities, and they accommodate up to 10 people. So really the only thing you'll need to bring with you is your toothbrush and maybe a change of clothes. They've got fast, unlimited wireless internet, dedicated workspaces, and fully equipped kitchens, and they're just a delight to stay in, a fantastic alternative to Japanese business hotels, which if you've ever stayed in one, you probably know they're tiny, they're noisy, fine for a night or two if you're on your own, but long-term or with a family, you'll probably feel you're in a jail cell very quickly. So if you want to give yourself a sense of space and freedom by renting a real home with comfortable Western beds, including all the necessities like baby bedding, children's toys, high chairs, you definitely want to reach out to Tokyo Family Stays. They've been at it for over a decade. They're a fully licensed minpaku or short-term stay operator. And as a special bonus for our viewers and listeners, they're also throwing in a breakfast basket upon arrival for anyone who books and mentions the Japan Real Estate Podcast or NTI. And not only for guests, if you're a property owner, you've got an investment property that you want to tweak for higher profits, or a holiday home that you want rented out when not in use via short-term stays, drop them a line today. See how they can help you maximize your property's income. And again, as a special bonus to our viewers and listeners, they're also offering a free audit of your existing short-term stay listings without any obligation whatsoever. So feel free to reach out to them at tokyofamilystays.com. Well worth your visit. And again, if you're in the market for a family home in or around the Tokyo metropolitan area, Emil's your man. Don't be shy to reach out to him as well at emil.gorgees, Gorgees, at tokyorealty.jp. So you don't necessarily have to be within a big city, but you want to be in a place that's actually has got stable population, stable employment, stable industries. And then you know that you're going to regularly be able to repopulate the property when it becomes vacant. And again, on the maintenance side, you want to make sure if you are buying a wooden structure, like say, those 6 or 8 or 10 unit blocks that you can buy in Japan are quite cheap. You can buy them for usually under $500,000 US. You can buy like a small building with say 4, 6 or 8 single like studio or single bedroom apartments. But if you're buying that because it's going to be a wooden structure, make sure that you're buying it 20 years or younger. And if you're buying a unit in a co-owned condo block, like a single apartment, maybe make sure the building is not older than 30 years on purchase, because they're going to keep renovating it, but building fees will go up as the building gets older. So that obviously shrinks your yield as well. Oh, and the other thing is you want to be within 10-minute walking distance from a train or a subway station, or in towns where they don't have train or subway within it to a tram station. Bus is not as popular in Japan as the other forms of transport.
Oh, buses
well,
are
there
pain.
you go. You're giving us more information that I'm learning so much, thinking about so much. You're giving me things that I'm not thinking about. And that's great because I know our listeners may be in my situation as well.
Yeah, and that bus point that you made was huge because those buses, they'll take random days when they're off, and you, unless you're really good with that schedule, you'll like go wait at a bus stop, and if you don't look at the schedule, you'll be sitting there for 15, 20 minutes. You're like, what's going on? This bus should have been here by now. And yeah,
if you think about your typical salaryman on his way to work in the morning, there's no way they're going to move into a property where they have to take a bus every morning. No. They just won't do it. This is more the buses are more the domain of like retirees, housewives, the unemployed, the people who are actually commuting to and from work every day. So if they're a family, they'll have at least one car in the house. In that case, if you're actually looking into a place that's got a parking spot attached to it, then that's not a huge concern. But because of Japan's demographics, most of your tenants are going to be singles or maybe young couples without kids. And those people would usually not have a car. So the distance to the station is really important.
Yeah, that's great. And like Jen said, I'm soaking all this up because I was never even thinking about it as an investment. I was thinking it was just like since like I said, we go there. We try to go there every year at least, and we stay with my mother-in-law or sister-in-law. But hey, maybe we'll find a house around there somewhere.
That's a totally different set of criteria, though, right? Like if you're buying a place for your own use, then you just buy what you like and feel comfortable in.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that kind of brings me to my next point. If I were personally, just me individually, if my wife wasn't part of the picture in terms of purchasing, and it was just me as a single foreigner looking to purchase a home, or a couple who are both foreigners, not one of them that is a Japanese citizen, what are some of the challenges that a foreigner might face when trying to purchase a house in Japan? I know that for rental properties, there's a lot of things where you need a guarantor of sorts, like a Japanese guarantor, or a very hefty down payment for rent, like key money and all that stuff for rental properties. But are there similar challenges like that for actually purchasing a property?
So the short answer is no. Essentially, if you're purchasing in cash, or if you're residing in Japan and you've got loan approval, or fairly likely to have your loan approved, then most sellers and agents would be happy to sell to you. They're not too concerned about you being a foreigner because it's transactional. They don't need to be in touch with you after the purchase, and off you go with the property. But again, you run into the same sort of challenges that we've mentioned at the start, is that they just don't know how to work with you, right? So everything in Japan, it's a running joke, but it's still very true about the fax machines, right? Like everything in Japan is done via post or fax machines or physical hanko, like stamps on documents. Everything needs to be handwritten and signed. So there is just no way that Japan will be again, Central Tokyo, Central Osaka, a few spots notwithstanding, your typical Japanese realtor in most normal places around the country is not going to be able to work with you if you don't have a local address, a local phone number, if he can't meet you face to face or pick up the phone and call you any time of the day and night. And they do that on weekends and evenings. And like, they don't even use voicemail here for some reason. I haven't actually, I'm not sure where that comes from, but if a Japanese professional wants to talk to you, they'll pick up the phone and call you. They're not going to send a message and ask you if they can call you or schedule a meeting. They're going to pick up the phone and call. And if you don't answer, they're not going to leave a message. They're going to try again 5 minutes later and 5 minutes later until they get a hold of you, because they want to give you some information that they can only relay on a phone call for some reason. So unless they can do that with you on a regular basis throughout the purchase process, they're just going to back off and not, they enter Japanese freeze mode. Like, they don't want to say no officially, but they just stop answering or stop replying or stop responding, right? So you want to either be present in the country and have somebody fluent in Japanese that can pick up the phone and attend meetings and sign documents and so forth, or you want to work through a proxy like ourselves.
Gotcha. Well, that's all. Like I said, I was about to say, if you need help, or if you're not in Japan, we'll just navigate. We can kind of point them and funnel them towards you.
Not only us, though. I mean, if you are in central Tokyo, there are some agents that are, I think Tokyo has about a dozen agents that can cater to foreigners that I'm aware of. And at least 3 of them I know personally that I can personally recommend as well. Osaka, I think, has about 5 or 6. Fukuoka has 2 or 3. Rest of the country, you might need someone like us. Yes.
Cool. Well, kind of bringing it back to the purchasing for the sake of business, whether it's a if you're doing a rental property, like an actual like apartment view, or if it's going to be more of like a destination, like travel destination, like bed and breakfast or something like that, where you're not expecting long-term rentals or anything like that, but it's just short-term bookings. What is the difference in terms of purchasing a property? Like you said, it is transactional. So, they just want the money and then they don't have to deal with you anymore as in terms of the agent. But when you're buying something for the purpose of running a business versus purpose of, personal, my own personal vacation home, are there other barriers that come into play where you need to have, like, do you have to have some type of proof of your business being established? You mentioned cash flows within the country. Is that even more so? Do you need to prove that your business exists? And what are those requirements that they may have for you as a business owner, or if you're planning to open or start a business once this property is in your possession?
So there's a big difference between just standard long-term rental leases or even monthly rental leases and guest houses, share houses, Airbnb, and that sort of thing, right? Mm-hmm. So as long as everything is done with a proper tenancy lease in place and the minimum occupancy period is 1 month or more, then that's pretty standard. You don't need to set up a business in Japan. You don't need to reside in Japan. As long as you get past the logistics of actually managing it with somebody on the ground, you can own it from overseas as an individual. There's no company set up or anything of that sort required. If you're talking about short-term stays, so anything that's done for periods of less than 1 month and without a tenancy lease in place, that's a whole different kettle of fish. So there are 2 ways to go about that one. One is officially called minpaku in Japan. That's a casual short-term leasing. And those are the types of properties that you'll see on Airbnb that are not actual resorts or hotels or so forth. For those, you need a licensed management company that's licensed to handle minpaku leases. And again, that's something that's going to be available usually only in bigger cities. There's just not enough business for them to set up shop in the smaller townships because aside from you, maybe no one's ever opened an Airbnb there, right? So they're not gonna have people on the ground who are able to serve you there. In the bigger cities, it's very municipal in nature. So in late 2018, the government revamped the minpaku, the short-term stay legislation, because it was a bit of a gray zone. Depending on who you ask, some people say that it was because people were just doing very unprofessional operations and it was getting dangerous and bothering the neighbors and so forth. Other people say there was a lot of pressure from the hotel lobby who saw that Airbnb was getting a little bit too popular for comfort for them. So whatever the reason, they've completely revamped the legislation in late 2018. And these days, the first thing they did is they gave owner unions of condo buildings now have the right, not just the right, by default, if they haven't specifically written in the owner owner union rulebook that short-term stays are allowed, then by default they are not allowed. So you cannot do that in a co-owned building that has an owner union. You can do that officially, theoretically, if you own the entire structure. So if you own the building or if you own a house, you can do that, but then it goes to municipal individual ward regulation. So the general national guideline is that you can only do that for half the year. So 180 days a year, you can rent the property out short term. And then each ward has its own regulation. So some of them necessitate a 24/7 call person within, say, 500 meters from the property at any given time. Some of them only allow you to do it on the weekend. Some of them dictate a certain distance from public facilities like nursing homes or elderly care or libraries or whatnot. So it's really a matter of which area you're interested in and what's allowed there. Beyond that, if you want to really do it kind of properly without worrying too much about these kinds of things and just be able to rent it out throughout the year and actually run a profitable business, you can apply for a hotel or inn license, which sounds big, but it's not really. It's about $1,000 for the application. You need to jump through some hoops as far as there needs to be like a certain area dedicated for like a reception area. There needs to be certain hygiene, fire, and safety regulations that you'll follow. But once you're granted this kind of license, which is maybe not doable in a completely residential area, but if the area is zoned even slightly commercial, then you should be able to do that there. And then you just, you put your license on the wall, you hire staff to actually run the property, and you're good to go.
Okay. Just easy as that.
Yeah, that's the process in theory. You still want to make sure that you're, like, before you actually go ahead and purchase a property that you think you're going to turn into that, you want to check into ward office regulations.
Yeah.
You want to get an architecture. So once you check with the ward office regulations, they'll give you a spec of what the property needs to look like to actually qualify for the license. And then you might want to bring an architectural inspection company in to see if the property doesn't qualify, how much it would cost you to tear a couple of walls down, install a few, for example, if there's, we don't deal much in short-term rentals, but this just off things that I've heard from people who do, like between the second or third floor or between each floor of the property, there needs to be a fire safety door, that kind of thing. So you just want to, it's not something that you jump into without some proper research, but it is doable, yes.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely, I think anyone really that would be even considering this option of doing this, proper research is definitely one of those, looking at those regulations and understanding what exactly you're getting into before you make that purchase.
You'd be amazed at how many people actually contact us and expect that they'll be able to buy one of those 20, 30,000 old IKEA homes out in the countryside and immediately lease it out Airbnb. There's a bit of education to be done, but which is fair enough. I mean, in other countries, it's not as strict as that. Like you can actually do that, but here it's not the case.
Wow. Well, this wasn't actually a question we were going to ask, but I'm curious just because of the global situation we are in currently. And, we're on our second year of the pandemic, being here. If you don't mind sharing with us and the listeners, how has the pandemic, affected your business? Because I know, I always hear articles in Japan, and they're always reporting, businesses are shutting down in Japan, or it's really rough over there. And it hurts me because Japan is like my second home. I go to Kyoto all the time. And so they're getting hit really hard. But, how is your business doing? And how are y'all keeping afloat until, foreigners can come back to Japan?
Well, not to be insensitive, but for us personally, 2020 was our best year to date, and 2021 was even better than that. And that's mainly because we serve a lot of investors, and investors are opportunistic bastards by nature. Whenever crisis hits, they know that there's going to be good deals to be had, right? So
you're not wrong. You're not wrong at all.
So we personally have not suffered from the crisis. In Japan, in general, like, it's funny you mentioned Kyoto. Businesses are definitely suffering in Kyoto, but if you ask the residents, and they've run some surveys, they are so happy with the tourists being gone.
I bet.
Like they want the
I'm
tourists to
sure.
never come back. Other cities, I mean, Kyoto specifically is very. I mean, in our Western, kind of tour. I mean, even as gaijins living in Japan, we're always going to be kind of tourists, right? So
Yeah,
in our eyes, Kyoto is like, oh, the tourist destination, but Kyoto is a powerhouse for professional services and academic and
it really
very.
is.
It's a white collar city with a lot of things going for it aside from tourism, and that sort of reflects what's going on in the rest of the country. So hospitality and retail businesses. Let's put it this way: hospitality was hit hard, but again, depending, like tourism resorts maybe were hit harder, but hotels that are within a certain distance from the city were not. Business hotels are slowly recovering because domestic traffic is now definitely happening again all over the country. Restaurants have suffered client-wise, but they were receiving huge subsidies from the government. I actually know quite a few people who applied for a food and beverage license because of those subsidies. They weren't even thinking to offer those services until they heard they're getting $600 a day just for staying closed, right? So the government has. I mean, I think in Asia we were the country where government subsidies for businesses hurt by COVID was probably the highest. So as in all things Japan, there are not going to be massive layoffs here. There's not going to be lenders foreclosing on mortgages. There's like an unspoken agreement between financial institutions and the government to keep things afloat, to avoid economic malaise. And whether it's the right decision or not is a topic for debate, but it's definitely helped to float the economy through it. Right? It's been doing very well. And even when they had lockdowns, they were very soft lockdowns, right? So restaurants couldn't serve alcohol, or they were asked to close after 8 p.m. People were politely asked to stay at home. And Japanese being Japanese, I mean, masks were a thing from the get-go here, right? Like everybody was wearing masks all throughout the winter anyway because of influenza. And so for them, it was a no-brainer to, like, everywhere you go, anywhere now, even in a small side street, everyone's wearing a mask, right? So the economy obviously has not been expanding, but compared to what it's been like in other countries, Japan is not suffering that much. Again, not to be insensitive, hospitality businesses, restaurants, bars, some retail stores, especially like luxury retail stores, were doing very well because everybody who couldn't travel overseas to spend their money had to spend it in the country, right? So all of the well-off shoppers are still here and they're very much active. But retail centers in smaller suburban areas, especially second, third floor shops and so forth, are hurting. But again, we're very fortunate in the sense that it's not nearly as bad as it is in other locations.
That's good to hear because, I know you say like you didn't really get hurt by it, which is great. Those people who know what they know when things go wrong, you act now because they're going to get better eventually.
Yeah.
But for the average person, like Doug and I, I'm sure people will be looking to, work with you in the future when they feel, oh, now I can do this, vacation home in Japan now that the borders are open.
Yeah.
So I'm sure they're excited to maybe work with you in the future.
I mean, holiday home shoppers for us haven't really dropped off that much in any case as well. I mean, if you're buying a family home and you're going to be moving in and spending every day of the year there with your family, then you definitely want to go in person and check out the homes with a real estate agent. And we don't really deal in that area much because it requires very local, hands-on accompanying buyers throughout the process. But holiday home shoppers seem to be, from the get-go with us, have been very, very comfortable with us viewing and doing walkthroughs on their behalf and just giving them a layout and of the land. And we even these days we even do renovations for them well, we've got people who've bought a holiday home and are completely renovating it via us. They haven't even been to the country yet. So that's never been an issue for them for some reason. And investors were having a field day. Now, not so much, because prices have started to recover again. But the first 6 months or so of the pandemic, there were really good deals to be had, especially in Tokyo and Osaka, which are usually not very affordable. It was a party for investors for a while.
Did this is more so of a question. I'm not sure if it really impacted Japan much, but in the U.S., I know during the pandemic, during the lockdown, like last 2 years, like the price of lumber and the price of like supplies to renovate homes has like skyrocketed due to shortages and logistical, like supply chain issues.
Yeah.
Has that? I know you just mentioned that you had done some renovations for folks who are buying investment homes and whatnot. Are those same like supply chain issues impacting those costs to renovate homes over there, or is it somewhat different since it's more of a, I don't know, is there a lot of importing of those types of materials that are used for those renovations, or is it all domestic driven?
There is. So Japan is very much an importer of a lot of raw materials. It's much more of an importing country than an exporting country. Prices have been affected to some degree, not super substantially, but what we have been seeing is a lot of delays, right? So renovations that were scheduled to start within a month started 3-4 months later because there was just no incoming materials. So that has been affected. The other thing that's been affected from a business standpoint is the nature of vacancies. So we're not seeing more vacancies than usual. In fact, we're seeing slightly less than usual because people, because of constant, soft lockdowns and not really quarantines, but people prefer not to relocate or move around so much during the pandemic. So we're not seeing too many vacancies, but when we do get a vacancy for exactly the same reason, it can be a lot longer because, again, people are not relocating, so nobody's moving in. So that's been affected slightly, but again, not to any significant degree. Delays is more than has been affecting us more than costs.
Gotcha.
Well, thank you for humoring me. I was just curious. But before we end our interview with you, I do want to kind of bring it open to you to, do you have any advice, last final advice that you could possibly give our listeners who are seriously considering purchasing a home in Japan? And what would you tell them?
Aside from everything that we've just spoken about, the other thing that we've never really touched on is the difference in mentality when you're doing business in Japan, right? So if you think about how it works in other countries, if you come into any country, whether it's a Western country or other countries within Asia, you would be coming in as a foreign investor or a foreign buyer, a cashed up foreign buyer or investor. There'd be a host of professionals just waiting to work with you, right? Like, give us your money, we'll find you the best property that we can get you, and you actually sort of have to sift through them to find the reliable ones, right? Here, it's exactly the other way around in the sense that everyone is reliable and professional, but they really don't want to work with you. So you really need to sift through them to find the ones that will agree to work with you from the get-go. And then everything here also is about relationships. So the Western mentality of, cash is king or the customer is king. The customer is king, but once they become a customer, and to become a customer in Japan, you need to build a relationship with the people that you're going to be working with. And if you start hitting agents with multiple requests and, where's the report I was waiting for? No, this potential property is not what I was looking for. What? Don't you get what I'm talking about? They're just going to not work with you at all. You're by nature more of a hassle for them to work with from the get-go. So you really want to do things the proper, slow pace Japanese way when you're working with Japanese professionals. And real estate is no different. It's actually an older school industry here. So just take your time, learn how things are done here. If you're walking through someone like us, then we'll guide you through it. But if you're doing it on your own, just listen and see how things are done and accept that they're not going to be done the way that you used to. And like all things Japan, like mind your manners is always a good way to start relationships here.
Definitely.
I think that's great advice.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, thank you again so much for joining us for this conversation. It was so much fun. like I said, I was a sponge. I was just listening. Like I forget that I'm actually supposed to be asking questions sometimes. So I'm like, just like, all right, I got to take some notes, like Jen was saying.
Yeah, you have no idea how appreciative I am of you coming on to the show, because, I don't know, I found this topic always so fascinating, but I was like, how can we get a discussion about it? Who can we get on to discuss like such a complicated topic that is real estate? Because I know in America, sometimes real estate gives us a headache just thinking about it. So we really do appreciate you coming on and really helping guide us and our listeners to, possibly owning a house in Japan. So
totally
I really
a pleasure.
appreciate that.
And I'm guessing your listeners are mostly audio oriented, just listening to a podcast. So
Yes.
if you Google or on the iTunes store, wherever you're looking, Japan Real Estate Podcast, we're the only ones out there. We put out content once, twice a week, and it's quite popular and quite informational, I think. So help yourself to subscribe, and you'll love it, I think. If you
Yeah, and you're also on YouTube, correct? That podcast?
Yes. The podcast is on YouTube as well. Japan Real Estate, Japan_real_estate on YouTube.com. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, there you go. And what is your, just so if folks wanted to reach out to you for your business, what would your website, what would they need to go to?
So the website is nippontradings.com, Nippon with a double P, tradings with an S. So nippontradings.com, all one word. And best way to reach me personally is via LinkedIn. I'm the only one out there with that name. So don't be shy to reach out.
Awesome.
There you go.
Well,
And
thank you
we'll make
so
sure we put
much.
that in there. Yeah.
Yes, we're going to put it in our show notes.
Very much a pleasure. Good talking to you.
Yep.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. So yeah, huge thanks again to the Krewe of Japan for having me on. It was a blast speaking with you. I really enjoyed our time together. Hope you did it as well. Now, before we go, we're also, as always, going to tell you and also link to our other sponsor's website. That's Hiroshi Shimizu, immigration lawyer and administrative scrivener. If you're thinking about moving here on a more permanent basis, or you're already in Japan on some sort of a temporary visa and you want to switch to a longer term or permanent one, or if you're considering setting up a local company or a branch office of a foreign company and you've got any sort of business or visa related inquiries, or even if you just want to find out what your options are on any of these topics, feel free to contact Hiroshi Shimizu. You can find him at japanimmigrationexperts.com. And he can help you set up a company, apply for any kind of visa, or just provide you with the best advice and extremely affordable consultation related to these topics. And he's already done that for many of our listeners. So feel free to reach out to him. Again, that's japanimmigrationexperts.com, and you'll be well on your way. And that's it from us for today, folks. Hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Japan Real Estate Podcast. Do share it with your networks, and please let us know what you think. So leave us a short rating or review on the iTunes Store, on Spotify, or just drop us a line in the comment section or wherever you might have found this episode. We love hearing from you. Hope to have you with us again next time, and until then, have a great